folks, Randy Newberg here. We are rolling right along with this 7-episode series that we're doing with Shane Mahoney and the Wild Harvest Initiative. This is episode number 5. And in number 5, we're going to get into some real examples. Some of the work that Shane has done with state agencies. In this one, he'll use examples, I think mostly from Texas, one of his participating partners. And he's going to talk about what wild harvest equates to in terms of number of meals, pounds or tons of protein harvested naturally and wildly through hunting, through foraging, through fishing. We don't think of fishing as a hunt. It really is a hunt, and it is part of that wild harvest that we all enjoy, and in some cases that we rely upon. So here we are with episode number 5. Hope you like the first 4. This one we're going to get into a lot of real life examples that Shane is putting together with his team of scientists, and hopefully you'll watch it, hopefully you'll share it. So Shane, I'm thinking about all this wild harvesting that's happening and has happened for my whole life, and that I hope continues far beyond my time here. It just seems that there are so many opportunities if we include more people and more organizations and more groups, and we don't make bifurcations of, well, that's public land or that's private land. It's land that can produce wild food. It's waters that can produce wild food. It's groups interested in wild food. Mm-hmm. Do you think we sometimes get lost in the weeds of what can be accomplished if we were to look at it as a more inclusive of everybody in all places?
I think it's more a case, Randy, that we have built up institutional systems piece by piece when a problem seemed needing to be solved. Mm-hmm. Let's say it was something about, how do we create and maintain public lands? So that was a whole focus of a group of people who, set the lands aside, when in the old story we assume it's true of Roosevelt, drawing the circles around the the national forest and the dying moments of things of his presidency. And so there'd be a whole cadre of people who would work on that as an aspect of conservation. Then we had, of course, the whole issues of private lands conservation, which, as far back as Leopold's time, was front and center of the contemplation of a lot of theoreticians and intellectuals about what it was going to take to ensure that conservation worked on the majority of lands in the United States of America, which, of course, are, in fact, privately owned. Yeah. Excuse me. And that then became, and still is, a sectoral issue that has its players and has its proponents and maybe has its detractors. But they are working hard, within that channel. It's like a braided stream, you have your public lands and your private lands, then you get they braid again, of course, with all kinds of different little problems that come into play. And I think part of the problem was that, the initial founders of the movement naturally were drawn to, these kinds of categorical kind of approaches. Again, what would we do with forestry? What would we do with logging? What would we do with mining? What would we do with energy development? Each of them presented a formidable challenge in its own right. And for those engaged in it, it was an exciting and productive field of work to be in, to work on these particular problems. And we went very much, too, into the idea of species conservation. We thought about elk in a big way, and we thought about moose in a big way. And waterfowl. Totally. And we developed amazing programs there. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan probably stands out as one of the greatest achievements the world has ever had with respect to the conservation of wildlife, and it's still fulsome and strong and ongoing and inclusive and involves sharing between the two countries, indeed between more than 2 countries now, as Mexico has been brought into this. Mm-hmm. So, I think through no malicious intent, the idea was to do what human beings and scientists in particular, and remember, science was starting to, put its bony hands into all of this, and stir it all up. And science loves reductionism, right? Mm-hmm. Science loves to take problems and break them down into smaller problems, so the smaller problems can be dealt with, and then eventually somebody people like me who love synthesis gather it all up and try to bring it back up into some kind of holistic approach. So we went through that phase too, very much of looking at species. But we are coming to a point, aren't we? And we can see this in the broader discussions where, private landowners and public lands, these things are being discussed. They're being laid side by side. They're being viewed as part of a bigger picture. And yes, some will be proponents of public and some will be proponents of private, right. But nevertheless, we are talking about it. We're also talking more and more about cooperative conservation, where we can move somewhat away from the highly regulatory nature of conservation, where you encourage people to do the right thing and they cooperatively do the right thing because we find ways to bring benefits to them for doing that. Yep. We're moving more and more and more towards the idea of landscape conservation, where it's not just this little piece of land over here that stops at 200-foot elevation or something. It's the whole watershed. It's the whole mountain series. It's the whole range that we're talking about, and so on. So I see us moving in very much in the right directions with respect to this. And at one time, we also really only thought about human benefits and human livelihoods in terms of people who actually could take something very practical from that land. They might have been an outfitter, so they had a business that serviced hunters, and therefore it was understandable. Or they had a raft floating company to bring people down the river, and so that was very understandable. But I think we're starting to understand that, all of this is now part of this. There are people who want to float the rivers and not fish. There are people who want to float the rivers and fish. There are people who don't want to float the rivers and who want to fish. They just want to wade from the shoreline. There are people who want to hunt. There are people who want to bird watch. There are people who just want to go out and camp in these beautiful places. So I think they're all building constituents, and while that drives a lot of people nuts, particularly in the state agencies, because everybody is demanding a piece of them, the bottom line is, ultimately, isn't this what we want?
Right, every one of us.
We want every one of us involved in nature, and we want every one of us speaking up for nature, and I can be the rafter who says, I don't want my river dammed because I like to raft it, and I could be the fisherman who say, I don't want my river dammed because I like to fish it. And I could be the hunter who said, I don't want that river dammed because it fools up the distribution and the movements of the animals that I like to hunt, and I don't want to have that done either. And so eventually we get these voices for nature that says we don't want it. And of course, in the early political manifestos, the early political plays that would take place, when that would happen, politicians would at some point, kind of say, well, okay, you don't want that, well, what do you want? And, now we're getting much better at answering that question. Because what we're saying to them when they ask us that question, hoping that we will zip our lips about it, we simply fire back and say we want something better. And that's a good enough answer because you're an elected official and I, who elected you, are saying I want something better. Yeah. So you bring me something better. And I think we are starting to see this happening in the sort of broader environmental movement. Some of it took rebels in the early stages to do certain outrageous things, crawl up the Empire State Building or whatever it might be, or do whatever they had to do. But I think now more and more people are saying that there just simply has to be a better way. Why can't we have cities with a lot more green space? There's not one reason in the world why we cannot have that. Right. Why can we not have people growing vegetables, designing homes and buildings in cities where every person involved in that building has access to a garden that grows on the outside or on the rooftop of those particular houses, buildings? Why can't we do that? Well, of course we can do that. And one day we will do that, I hope. And then we will begin to see that nature and ourselves can be, a part of everything, and we can be a part of all of that. And just imagine in a big company, a really big company, and you got 5,000 people living in one of these gerbil-celled buildings where everybody got a little.
They call them campuses.
Okay, campuses. I'm a little out of touch. Anyway, they're all in there in their little wheels, doing whatever they have to do. But just imagine part of their responsibility on some kind of schedule was that they all had to play a part in tending these rooftop gardens. Maybe 1 hour a day or 5 hours a week or something like that. That's part of their job. They may be a graphic artist, they may be a filmmaker, they may be an economist, they may run the books of the building, they may be the CEO, and make it egalitarian so that everybody at some point is up there with their sleeves rolled up, putting their hands in dirt and growing things and growing foods. Now they can give that food away to people who don't have much food. They can take that home to their own families and things of this nature. Do you think there is one iota, one reasonable impediment for us not doing that? There's not a goddamn good reason in the world for us not doing that.
Yeah.
So this is all part of the issues of harvesting and the issues of raising healthy food for people. And then another component is going outward from cities to harvest wild animals and wild plants and things that are out there elsewhere.
Yeah.
We can live in a much better world.
Yeah. For a better world for us and for, as you call them, the wild others.
The wild others, and for future generations of both.
Yeah.
For the elk that will be born 100 years from now.
Yeah.
For the lamb that will be dropped 150 years from now on one of these mountain peaks.
I like that vision.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's far enough. But
Well, it's a place to start.
I'm thinking about my role and my activity that makes me a wild harvester of, I hunt, I fish, I love eating wild berries. I don't know if it's just me or if it is the activity that brings this feeling that I feel a deep responsibility, maybe a responsibility or an obligation that someone else who doesn't participate in that may not feel. Am I weird in thinking that I'm getting so much I got to give more back?
I think there's through your life and career, Randy, you've come to a point that not everybody comes to, of course, in your sense of self-awareness. I mean, that you're I've known you for a number of years now, and it's immediately obvious you're very self-aware of this aspect of your persona and of your life.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it might be said that you have come to it, so to speak, through many channels and many experiences over a considerable period of time. But I think there is a moral obligation on the part of any human who takes the life of another living wild creature. I think there's an order of magnitude moral obligation and responsibility to give back to conservation compared with somebody who may never have done that. Mm-hmm. Life is sacred, and death comes hard to all of us. And when our activity involves the conscious, willful death, the killing of a sentient creature, that in the case of higher mammals and birds undoubtedly feel that bullet or that pellet or that arrowhead in exactly the same way you would. No difference whatsoever. Then I think we have a much greater responsibility to never be able to say, no, I will not help in some specific way. And I mean help wildlife. Mm-hmm. And I do not put in that category that I bought a permit. And I do not put in that category that I bought a rifle and I paid an excise tax because some far-sighted pair of Congress people managed to bring forward that excise tax, the Bittman-Robertson tax, that we all pay. I do not believe that paying that tax makes anybody a conservationist. And I don't believe that just because a person buys, as we call them licenses at home, but you call them permits for hunting.
Yeah, either.
That makes people a conservationist. But I do believe that anyone who has taken a life has a responsibility to give back, not in an American sense, in that, oh, I've taken one life, I've got to work to give back another life. I don't mean it that way. I mean there's a philosophical, there's a moral, there's an ethical responsibility to do something more. And that something more can be anything as simple as, look, it can be cleaning up litter in a field. It can be cleaning up a small stream. It can be volunteering to tear down some old fencing or to build some new fencing if it's needed for some purpose. It can be helping to, provide water to animals during a time of stress. It can be rescuing animals if they're under duress somehow, trapped in a river's ice or something of this nature. I think, or maybe planting beautiful flowers in their home to attract pollinators, or there's any number of things that they could do. But I absolutely have always believed, from the first time that I killed an animal, that there was a need for me to do something for them. I don't think it was salving my conscience, even though taking the life of an animal, particularly up close, is a difficult thing to do. Hell, putting down an animal you love, a cat, a dog, a horse, who is now too old to live, is a very difficult experience for most people. Extremely difficult. Because that death is final.
Yeah.
It's over.
And
they're never coming back again. And so I really do believe, and I think hunters have made many declarations about this with their non-governmental organizations, the sheep foundations and the elk foundations and the backcountry hunters and anglers and the mule deer foundations and the Dallas Safari Clubs and on and on and on, the quail and the pheasants. We've made many demonstrations through our groups. But I think what's most important is for the individual to find some way, and perhaps even when they are doing that, whether it's a man or a woman who's done the hunting, to actually take their little humans, if they have any, with them when they're doing these things they're doing in support of wildlife, so that they pass on to those little humans this idea that if you ever do decide that you want to harvest these animals, and you're going to take their life to feed yourself, then you too must develop this code. And this is the code that I have taken a life in nature, and I will now work some part of my life for nature. I believe that is I believe that ought to be sort of taught in hunter education classes, and I think it ought to be principle number one.
Yep. Now, if there's one thing that's unique to the life or the communities that I've been a part of, people will ask me, where's this generational, always looking for the next generation comes from? And I never have a really good explanation for it, because I just inherited it from my elders. But I look at other cultures who are wild harvesters, and the same thing is taking place there. It is teaching the next, investing them in that, in the hopes that they understand, they'll value it, and they'll protect it and care for it. It is not, the more I think it's unique to me, or people comment that they observe it's unique to me or my family or my community, it's not.
No, it's not. What I think can become a little unique, however, is this kind of purposeful give back. Being inculcated into a culture that cares, that can happen, sort of fluidly and naturally. But beyond that, I think we need to have this idea of a code, that, you were a person of X disposition up until that day that you squeezed that trigger and that animal some distance from you fell. And when you approached it and touched its eyes, it had no corneal response, and you knew that life had gone from it. And if you had not done that, that animal, that moose, that mountain lion, that bear, that elk, they would still be standing as you saw them. They would still be feeding, breeding, fighting, escaping predators, doing all those kinds of things. You took that.
Yeah.
Now, you took it for what I believe is a legitimate purpose. It is part of our ecology, but there's no denying we took that life.
Yeah.
And I really feel that we ought to be, in our hunter education courses, we oughtn't to soft pedal this either. I mean, I think it should be almost like, you do community service if you're a bad person and you do make a little crime. You don't not too serious, but you do something wrong, and you have to do some community service. I'm not saying hunting is a crime, but my point is that you could look at it in somewhat the same way, that you want to give back as a result of some action that you took.
Yeah.
And I feel we could then have armies. I mean, our organizations, Elk Foundation, for example, has some elk hunters in it, but it sure as hell doesn't have all the elk hunters in it,
Right.
does it?
No.
I believe we should have every elk hunter in those kinds of organizations,
Right.
helping them to do things,
Yeah.
to give back. Right?
Yeah. Same with
Yeah.
all of our groups, and I think the point for me always is I can do more individually.
Yep.
I can try to encourage others to do more individually. And where are the barriers that are slowing me down or they're almost self-imposed of my biases or how I view this community or that community. I accept anybody who loves wild places and wild things. That's the denominator for us to move forward. And all the other stuff to me doesn't really matter. And I sometimes wonder, do we find reasons to partition ourselves based on the history and the habitual, or maybe just the human condition? And by overcoming that or suppressing that, we look to everybody and say, hey, this should be of value to you also.
Well, I think
and contribute to it.
I think there is that value. I mean, I think that everyone in society should contribute to the natural world that they're dependent upon. Personally, I think every country should instate a very small payment. I wouldn't call it a tax, because I don't think it's a tax, but I think every country in the world should have something like a $5 per household once a year payment. That's called the eco coin or some damn thing. I don't know. Raise a bit of money to do some things, and people can see, the products of that helping people. But I think the people who kill things, I think we're a different kettle of fish, and we have different responsibilities.
Yeah. No, I would agree. We are different.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are.
Yeah.
And that the experience of doing it changes you.
Yep.
I mean, and
Of course it will.
no one can deny that even the first time maybe it's a fish when you're a very young person, and that becomes food, there is some start of that fundamental equation that something died, so I'm living. And later, as it becomes these larger sentient beings, that is I mean, here I am, I don't know how many times animals have funneled through my freezer to my plate, and I've been responsible for that. But you were talking about walking up, and that animal no longer responds. And it occurs to you that, again, this is terminal. This is the end for that thing.
It is.
It still is a very heavy obligation.
Sure it is. Well, it's the heaviest obligation.
It's, you try to reconcile it, and you do reconcile it, but it's not casual.
No.
And I guess that's good,
because
it forces us to think about it.
Of course it's good.
Whenever I think of wild harvest, there's always the topic that enters related to animal welfare. I've heard you talk about that before, Shane. You don't view hunting and animal welfare as
No.
You do a very good job of blending that and explaining why they are so so
Yep.
important as a combined
Yep.
principle.
Yeah. I always come back to, the ideas of people I have admired in my life and in the historical figures I have admired. And one of the really consistent things about those individuals has been that they were predominantly preoccupied with living life to the full. And they're an odd mixture of people. They go from great drinkers and fighters to, soft-palmed poets, and it's a great menagerie of all the way from Lord Byron to Peter the Great. I mean, these are people. But the idea of life as being something so precious that you should not waste any of it has always been something of great value to me, and something that I carried from a very, very early age. And partly too because probably I saw some people close to me die very young, and that probably had an impact on that as well.
Yeah.
But it easily transcended from my world of the human environments in which I was in, family or university or whatever it might be. It easily transitioned to animals, because it was always so ridiculous to me when people would remark that an animal had, I don't know, some kind of limitations, or it was just a dumb animal, or just it didn't know really what was going on, or when it was so bloody obvious that you could, if you had one brain cell firing, and that's all you had, you could tell when a dog was happy and when a dog was sad. So I don't know what they were doing with the rest of the brain cells they had, but anyway, I just could never figure out how people could not see, that animals foraging, even domestic animals foraging freely on open grasslands, for example, or up in, running up elevations to feed on high meadows, or in Newfoundland going out on the edge of those ocean peaks and getting the grasses that are protected but are growing just under the edges, and leaning over to get all that beautiful forage for them. It's so very clear that animals love life, and they feel good under some circumstances and not on others. And so ultimately for me, it is for both people and non-human animals. How can they enjoy, independent of us, the very best of life? And if we are involved with them, either we have them in our homes or we raise them as, animals for consumption, how can we give them the very best of lives anyway? And then how can we, when it comes time to kill them for food, how can we do it in such a way that is as painless and is as least traumatic as possible? Dr. Geist, the man who, described first the North American model, and with whom I wrote the book on the model 3 years ago, he raised a lot of animals, a lot of vegetables as well, but he raised rabbits, and he raised chickens, and he raised geese, and he raised them all for food. In the end, he fell in love with his geese too much, and he just let them grow old and die. but with his hens and with his rabbits, he would harvest them. And I can see him now in the little space where he had the cages with the hay in there, and always putting his hand in the cages when he was feeding them, rubbing the rabbits down and talking to them and so on and so forth, and then putting the big buck bunny into the little pen bunny with the other little small female bunnies, and letting nature take its course, which, boy, they don't need any enticement. There's no courtship, let me tell you. It's just, wow. And and then, taking him back out and putting him back in his cage. And then, there came a certain time where they, of course, had to be killed. And so he'd wait for me to come, to his home. And he had a little 22, single shot 22. And he'd say, "Shane, can you help me?" And the first time he asked me, I thought he just wanted me to maybe help clean the bunnies or whatever.
Yeah.
But it soon became clear that what he wanted me to do was to kill the bunnies because he
Yeah.
was too attached to them now. So we would take the little bunnies out and we would lay them in the grass, facing away from me, and they would be feeding very happily because now they're out on natural grass. They're not just in their little cages. And I would put the 22 just, right behind their heads and shoot them, and they would die instantly. And all they would have seen in the moment of their death was, first of all, they would have experienced this moment of just great freedom with the wind and the sun, and they weren't in the barn, they weren't in their little cages. Then they had all this beautiful green grass that they were feeding on, and then, and then it ended.
Yeah.
And there were different ways we could have killed those animals, of course. When we killed the chickens, and as a boy I killed lots of chickens, in the way that many of us have. He'd grab the poor chicken, put him on the chopping block, take his head off, and he'd run around. That always caused a little bit of excitement for people. It's kind of a strange thing to see. But with Dr. Geist, we would go out, 11 o'clock at night. And we'd go out 11 o'clock at night, and we'd raise up the little opening board that allowed us access to where they laid the eggs.
Mm-hmm.
But the roosts were just inside there, and we could reach forward and we could literally take them quietly in the dark out, and lay them on the chopping block. And he wouldn't do that either, Sometimes he did, but if I was there, he'd much prefer that I would do this. So the point was, that was a microcosm of considering animals that were bound, fully intended for food, and only for food, that their caretaker, the human being who was caretaking them, clearly had a great deal of fondness for them.
Mm-hmm.
And we found a way, and really he found the way, I shouldn't say we did, he did, found the way to give them as calm and as painful and as unexpected a death as possible, which is not easy with domestic animals.
Yeah.
Believe me, when the pigs are brought in the trucks to the slaughterhouse, my office in the wildlife division was across from an abattoir. I can tell you that the agitation that comes from, or the tension from those buses, you can smell it. And those animals know they are coming to a place where something not good is going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing industrial pig farmers, I'm just telling you what I've witnessed.
Right.
So some of that we can't change, but a lot of people will come to me because I've written a lot about my love for animals, and I have many times unabashedly stated that the loss of animals that I have had in my life as personal companions, when I lost them, it was absolutely equal to losing family members. And this upsets a great many people, believe me, have found that offensive. But I'm sorry, that is exactly how it is. And I think it's exactly how it is for a lot of people, not just Shane Mahoney. So naturally, when I tell stories like that, which I absolutely mean, and some of those animals I think about almost every day, more so than some of the family members I have lost, and I just have to be honest. And, the idea that we should not care for them, even if we do have to kill them, is ridiculous. And the idea that they can come to mean so much to us that they can almost equal our families, that is just a truth for me. And therefore people ask me, well, how can you hunt?
Yeah, I'm sure everybody's thinking that.
They ask me that. And I mean, look, I'm not joking about this thing with animals. I consider them equal. I don't think there's one iota of difference between us any more than there's difference between the migrating crane and the blue whale. Of course there's difference, but I view no difference in any sense but that between us and any other animal, and that's all we are as an animal. If we could come to terms with that, I think the world would be a better place. So, but my answer to that question is, first of all, if I have to make a choice between feeding myself with an animal that has lived its life in freedom, total, and I mean total freedom, you know.
Yeah.
When I would follow the caribou every day, which I did for many years, on foot by myself, I would follow them every day. The saddest part of my day was when darkness came, I had to set up a tent. But they just kept moving across that landscape. And I wanted so much to be able to just continue to do that, but of course I needed to eat. I couldn't live off the lichen and nibble my way across the land. And of course I didn't want to break my neck out there in the total darkness, so I had to live in something. And you get to understand how much they value their life and their existence, and how happy they are in the sun and the wind, and how happy they are when they have good food, and how happy they are when they are drinking clean water, and how happy they are when flies are not bothering them, and so on and so forth. And so if I have the choice between eating meat, which I eat because it's very healthy for me and provides me with almost every amino acid that I need, which is of course why we started eating meat originally, if I can acquire that by taking the life as humanely as possible of an animal that has lived free over one that I know in many cases just simply cannot live that freely, chickens and hogs particularly, then I choose that. And I think that, for me, is a classic animal welfare decision. The animal has lived the beautiful life. And I very much choose when I can to next shoot. I know a lot of hunters don't agree with that, but I do strive for that whenever I feel comfortable, when I have a close shot, when I have steady rest, and all of these kinds of things, and I know which rifle I'm using. I attempt to break that spine as close to the skull as possible so that it is instantaneous death. Mm-hmm. There's too much that can go wrong in a skull shot because of bone and deflection, and the antlers in particular can get in the way. But at any rate, that's what I strive for. And I think, even without that, if it's a lung shot or a heart shot, if that's the best, that presents itself, then of course you have maybe 2 minutes, before the animal goes down. And by that time, it's losing consciousness because it's lost blood, and then you can humanely finish the animal. But the animal has lived 15, 10, 8, 15, 20, 25 years, depending on what species you're hunting, in the wild, every day, unbothered by human beings. And even in the hunt, probably had absolutely no idea that this was going to befall him or her. And then it was over. And so I have absolutely no qualms about calling myself an animal welfare advocate, and I am one. I mean, a dog chained on bothers me viscerally. So I'm sure that may offend some of the people who are going to look at this, but a dog chained on bothers me viscerally. And there's lots of times that maybe that's necessary, but that's how I react to it. But I do not have any qualms whatsoever about taking an animal's life for food and doing it myself rather than waiting for a farmer or rancher friend of mine or a chicken, person raising chickens or someone else to do that for me. And so I think this is a really big point that the hunting community ought to get over itself. The hunting community is afraid to talk about things like animal welfare. I don't know what. They think they think they're going to be wimps if they talk about something like animal welfare or some damn thing. I don't know what it is. You know, maybe they all have small wieners. No offense to anyone in the audience here, but you know what I mean. I don't know what the frig it is, but it just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. We should be the ones out there talking about this, Randy. We should be the ones saying we know animals, we know how they look, we know when they feel good, we know their behaviors, and therefore, you know, we should be a real voice for this movement about animal welfare. And I know, I'm practical. I know that there's only so much we can do for many domesticated species. I do know that. I absolutely know that. But wherever we can treat domesticated species, give them more space and more room and more light and more air and more interesting social interactions and so on and so forth, I think it's our moral responsibility to actually do that for them.
Yeah.
I do. And I don't see why it's so hard to get people to talk about that and say it. Hunters are a powerful voice, and if we joined the animal welfare movement and said enough is enough, no more of this cruelty, no more of this mistreatment, we're not going to tolerate it.
Yeah.
And get over this worry that then someone's going to say, well, you shoot them, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, take the time to learn the argument and explain to people how different that all is.
Yeah. That's more.
I feel very strongly about this particular issue, and I just know that deep down a lot of hunters feel the same way, but they're reluctant to wade into the debate.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not reluctant to wade into the debate.
No, I've heard you say it many times
Yeah.
and articulate it very well, and it comes down to you've always made an emphasis on how the animal lived.
Yes. Yes.
And a lot of people want to focus on how the animal died.
Yes.
And
we can, with our new sophisticated tools, you know, very accurate rifles, you know, and stands that we can put them on if we want, or rest, you know, we can shoot very accurately if we just pay attention to a few very simple things.
Yeah.
And then we can give that animal almost an instantaneous death. And there won't be a lot of us who will be so blessed.
Right. Right. No, we among ourselves.
Yes.
We would.
Most of us will grow old and grow frail and die under circumstances that if we were to imagine it right now, we would say, well, that's not really ideal,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, how could I prevent that?
Yeah, like fall dead in your sleep, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what I think happens to a well-hunted animal. He or she falls dead in their sleep.
And when you have platforms like I do, I end up in discussions about people who want to almost claim some virtuosity because of their non-use of any type of animal.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Vegetarianism, veganism, whatever you want to call it. And I struggle with seeing that as some sort of complete picture. To me, it seems like an incomplete picture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't engage with them because very often it's, you know, our life experiences have led us to such diverse paths.
Quite different, yeah.
It's not worth the discussion. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, Shane, because I'm sure there's listeners and there's viewers who are not immune to that discussion or being presented with that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think the vegetarian or vegan community, of course, is a diverse one too, and you have people who are, you know, tend to proselytize about their choices for diet more than others. Some just pursue those diets and they're happy doing it and so forth. And I admire the people who adopt those diets on the basis of principle. If they really feel that animals should not be killed, that they make the effort to develop a lifestyle based on that. I have to say I have real respect for the people who do that. I think we are seeing, of course, that to some extent some of that is about some sense of naturalness that they have. It's not the same naturalness sense that we might have, but they but they do. and they feel it's no longer natural, you know, to kill animals to feed ourselves. I disagree with that, but I certainly admire the people who carry it far enough that they change their diet completely. And of course, you can develop very healthy vegetarian diets. There's no question about it. We also have a small phenomenon that's emerging where people in that space, people who are vegetarian, are in some cases willing to make, if you will, exceptions and include meat, but when they do, it's usually meat from something wild fish, or wild fowl, or wild ungulate, wild deer, whatever. And I think this is this, of course, to me, makes a huge amount of sense because, you know, my diet, my preferred diet is very much what Cro-Magnon would have eaten, which is basically composed of meat, big vegetables, heavy, coarse vegetables like kales or asparagus or things of this nature, for an evening meal. I'm not big on having a big pot of, you know, soft potatoes or things of that nature. A full plate of green things and a significant piece of cooked fish or cooked meat is, to me, the absolute ideal food. And I love leaves, so I haven't given up my tree nesting past completely, because I can easily eat a half bag of kale leaves, you know, just eating them like a good ape that I am. But I think we have to think about this in a broader scale.
In what way?
Like, right now we know we have billions of people who rely on the harvest of wild living things, fish, mammals, birds, reptiles, etc. And we know that that's essential for them because they have obviously adopted for lifestyles and cultures, and there may be reasons why they cannot even be vegetarian in a particular ecosystem where they live or whatever. Because it's not that easy to pull all those pieces together to get it right. But just imagine if the world decided that all 8 billion of us were going to become vegetarian. Now, there's a proposition for those of us who think about how the world would work. So first of all, we'd have a system where you obviously would have to massively increase the footprint of fruits and vegetable kind of and grain kind of production. If you fly over the United States of America and look down from your aircraft, one of the things that you're most impressed by already at the current state of play is just how the land has been divided up and sectioned up, and you know, how it's all already seemingly being farmed for a lot of purposes. Now, we know a lot of that is used to feed cattle, and about 40% of that food goes to raising cattle. And so presumably that 40% would no longer go there, it would just go to people, so there'd be some savings there. But we would still have to withdraw from the wild a very significant percentage of land that is currently occupied by wildlife species.
Right.
And we know that under intensive agriculture for plant agriculture, you know, the amount of wildlife diversity is very low, and it is often pretty much relegated to the tiny few little scrubby areas that might lie on the margins, you know, in the rough fields or the little bank edges or things of this nature. And in fact, we have whole government programs to help people encourage to keep that, don't we?
Yes.
But the truth of the matter is we don't have abundant wildlife in those circumstances, and that would only extend that footprint of essentially wildlife depleted areas, or wildlife deserts essentially, or wildlife menageries, in the sense that it would only attract a few species that benefited directly from those planted species.
Right.
And so the cost to the biodiversity of the world, I don't know what it is, I can't give you a number, but it would obviously be significant.
Right.
So at some point in time, we have to accept I think, that there is perhaps no way in which human beings can live where animals and animal populations and even perhaps animal species will be placed at risk.
Yeah.
Because the farmland that is created and that displaces wildlife, no, it's not a circumstance where somebody shoots the animals before they leave the farm, so to speak.
Right.
But the end result is that we end up on a planet with less biodiversity,
Mm-hmm.
fewer of certain things, and some things entirely that can find no place in which to live at all.
Yeah.
And then we also increase at the same time, when we vastly expand these landscapes for growing food, we inevitably massively increase animal-wildlife or human-wildlife conflict in terms of
Yep.
depredation on croplands and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. And we have to take action against that. I do not see any escape from our basic ecology. It is not a question of whether we will use natural resources of the world, whether we will use the wildlife of the world. The only question ultimately before humanity is whether we will do it sustainably and as humanely as possible, as credibly as possible, as responsibly as possible. But the idea that we can somehow enter a domain of human ecology that we call non-use, I just can't even begin to picture what that could look like under any circumstance.
Yeah.
Because if we drink water and we suck in air and we breathe out carbon dioxide and we displace wildlife by building massive, fruit and vegetable farms and things of this nature, we are interacting in a way with the natural world that is having an impact absolutely. I prefer to see landscapes teeming with wildlife, landscapes of diversity. I don't like the big monolithic plantings. I realize they are necessary in some cases. I don't like the big cattle yards assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
I do love to see cattle out free ranging on wild pastures. There are models in the world that I can look at. Sheep out on the pastures, beautiful things. I grew up with lots of sheep. I love sheep. I like to share sheep. I like to chase them. I like to have fun with them. There are all kinds of models in the world that are better than some. And the best model in the world is landscapes where we grow some vegetables, we harvest some wild foods and vegetables, maybe we raise small numbers, relatively small scale numbers of domestic animals, and the rest we provide by harvesting directly from the land the wild animals that's out there. In other words, there's no reason why we can't have a mixture of these things.
Right.
But to suggest that any option allows us to completely forego the idea of utilizing, in some cases killing or displacing or whatever, wild creatures on this planet for our own purposes, that scenario does not exist. And the only alternative, as I said, is to figure out how we are going to use them in the best possible way.
Yeah. That's, again, it's forcing people to think beyond what we see today and try to imagine.
Yeah.
I've at times told people, well, I'm not here to really argue with you, but do you want to expand a landscape where you see where the Ohio and Missouri rivers come together? It's soybean field. It's industrial level soybean fields. It is a monoculture. As you don't see much in the way of raccoons and skunks and songbirds and all the things that if you came to where the Yellowstone and Missouri come together, that is, there's a little bit of agriculture there, but not much. For the most part, it's natural prairie, it's natural bottomlands, it's wetlands. And look at the diversity of, do you want your food decisions to be responsible for taking this native, very complex landscape and prefer that it be converted to this monoculture? And that's about as far as I can probably have that discussion.
Yeah.
And people will look at it in whatever way. But I'm with you. I prefer the complex systems.
Yeah.
And let's find the way to be sustainable within that.
Yeah. Nothing says either that trajectory towards something like veganism or vegetarianism is always an upward graph.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we do know is the consumption of meat is rising rapidly in the world, of all forms of meat.
Yep.
And as the GDP of countries rise, so does the consumption of wild meat meat in those countries. That definitely occurs.
Yeah.
Yeah. That tells us something.
Yeah.
Meet and greet.
I'm lucky that I get to spend a lot of time harvesting my own wild food because of my culture, traditions, the geography of where I'm at. A lot of people don't get to do that.
Yeah.
And I would say when you look at how many people live near coasts, oceans, those oceans are some of the most abundant food environments, and that's part of the reason why Newfoundland,
And other peoples live there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've often heard you say that, let's not kid ourselves, commercial fishing is a hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen people be stunned of thinking, oh, I've always had this negative thought about hunting, but I eat an awful lot of fish.
Yeah.
So I've heard you say that before, Shane, and it's a very valuable discussion, I think, to add to the wild harvest discussion.
Well, thank you for that. I do believe it's an important discussion, and I think it cuts at a number of conceptual frameworks that I think we need to challenge, and I think we need to break them down and try to understand where they come from. You're absolutely right. There are lots of people who are opposed to hunting and would have no trouble whatsoever about eating fish. And that raises a series of questions in your mind. Well, how do you think the fish emerged here? Do you think it gloriously stepped forward on its tail fins and said, "Please place me on my plate, on your plate, because I'd love to be crunched up by you"? Yeah. The answer to that is no. Of course, the animal was provided in a certain way, and when you start to think about the way fishing occurs, and you think about the way hunting occurs, there are certain basic elements involved in both activities. Both activities start out with a search for a wild, sentient creature that is adapted to avoiding death and capture and pain by any source, whether it's a shark in the sea or a mountain lion on land or whatever it might be. We pursue those, search for those animals as a hunter and as a commercial fisherman. And once we find them, then we develop a strategy for harvesting them, for capturing them. In the case of global fisheries, that may be long line nets, it may be massive seines that we encircle and haul up, it may be cod traps as Newfoundlanders develop to catch the fish and bring it in over the side of their boats, but whatever it is a certain form of capture. The animal is brought on board, of course, in the case of fisheries, in some state of living. And I say in some state of living because depending on the fish species in case and the depth of the water from which it is taken and the fishing method by which it is lifted aboard the boat, they go through an excruciating circumstance where decompression doesn't work, their air bladders explode, and it is a very obviously frightening and distressing thing for the fish that are harvested. Then they are taken completely out of their medium so that they have absolutely no air. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's air all around them, but it ain't no good to fish, right?
Yeah.
And so then they lie on the backs of these big boats or in the bellies of boats, essentially suffocating, and then those fish are finally, they die or they're taken somewhere and they're dispatched into the belly of the ship or whatever, And then they are, of course, eviscerated and they're frozen or, kept cool or whatever the situation might be. In other words, we pursue them, we capture them, we kill them, we butcher them, we eat them. The hunter does exactly the same thing. He or she searches for an animal that they are in pursuit of, just like the commercial fisherman who's chasing cod or chasing herring or chasing mackerel, whatever it might be. Then when suddenly one of those animals is discovered, then of course the capture begins. Well, how will I possess that animal? How will I bring it to me? Where do I have to go to climb with a wind direction in a certain way that I'm not going to startle that animal and drive it over a ridge where I'm never going to be able to get it? How do I get myself in this kind of a position? How do I set, essentially, the fisherman? How is he setting his net? How is he going to surround this school of fish? We figure out how to get within shooting distance, then we shoot the animal. Now, none of us, I would say, or it is very rarely true, that any of us would actually allow the animal to spend a great deal of time wounded or gasping for breath. We shoot the animal, and if the animal does not die instantly, we try to get to the animal as quickly as we possibly can, and then we dispatch the animal with a shot to the spine or the brain so that it's absolutely, the animal is absolutely dead. We don't wait for it to flop around and,
Let's hope not.
No, we don't do that kind of thing, and then we eviscerate the animal and we carry the animal out, and then we butcher it and we consume it. I see absolutely no difference between global fisheries and hunting, but what I accept that there are a lot of things tolerated in global fishing that would never be tolerated in hunting.
Right.
Number one, you don't go hunting elk and decide along the way, if you don't have a permit, that you're also going to hunt and kill a white-tailed deer and a mule deer, and when you get back and the enforcement officer checks you, you say, well, I had the permit for elk, but this is my bycatch here, an elk and a white-tailed deer. No, that does not happen in hunting, and you know where you would end up if you ever made that statement to an enforcement officer, in jail. This happens all the time, day in and day out in world fisheries. There is this bycatch, sometimes very substantial, sometimes of rare species, sometimes of species of absolutely no value to us, that we're literally killing them frivolously. So the bycatch, this idea of being able to catch only what you're setting out for, has never become enough priority that we've developed the tools to actually do that exclusively, and that is ridiculous. It is wasteful, it is harmful to the natural environment, it should not be tolerated, and we know how to do better. Another thing that happens in world fisheries, you have a permit for an elk. You know what an elk means. An elk means an animal with one head and 4 legs and 1 body and 1 rack. That's what that means. And when you get that 1 elk, you have got your fill. That's all you're getting. Now, when you fish on the ocean, you also get a quota. And your quota might be 80,000 pounds of fish, and you're providing that fish to, let's say, McDonald's or some other big fish outlet in the world. And you put out these massive trawls behind your boat, and you come up, but all of a sudden, now you've got, you haul it all in, and all of a sudden you already have 75,000 pounds in your hold, and lo and behold, you bring up all this fish. You only need 5,000 pounds more because that's all you're allowed to take, or it's all you can carry. And so what do? You cut loose maybe 20 or maybe 25,000 pounds of living fish that will, of course, die. It will all die, because that's what happens to them when you bring them up to the surface and you throw them back down. They all die. And this goes on day in and day out and day in and day out. Then, another very common practice in these hunts at sea, fish are brought up onto the back of the boat. And the guy up top is looking for quality, and he looks down and he sees, oh, well, this particular harvest of cod, or this particular group of capelin, or this particular group of herring, too small, cut it loose. And then they're all dumped back at sea. This is going on night and day, every day, in the world's oceans. So not only do I make the point to people that all world fisheries are hunts, I make the point to people that the standards applied to conservation ethos and for sustainability, when you compare recreational hunting with commercial hunting at sea for fish, there is in fact absolutely no comparison. And the one that is far more ethical, far more controlled, far more careful about the environment, and far more careful about the population of the animal that it's actually hunted, there's no question that all of those benefits and improvements and values fall to hunting, and that virtually none of them to global fishing. In addition to that, and I will end here in this comparison of this, world fisheries are subsidized to the extent of 30% or more globally, which means no matter what you read about the landing of fishes globally and what that is worth, you knock off 30% off that value because right away, because that 30% is what governments are paying to keep those fleets at sea. And that is a global phenomenon. Even for small-scale fisheries, they are heavily, heavily, heavily subsidized. No one subsidizes the recreational hunting except the hunting community, especially in the United States of America, because that's where the funds come from for the state agencies to provide for that activity. So I know the world fishery circumstance very well. I'm from Newfoundland. I've seen it all. I know what happens. I know what happens when you have a capelin fishery and you bring up, your bags of capelin. There's a little small fish like Pacific Runyon. You bring them all up, and they became very, very fashionable at one point when they're dried. They're delicious when they're salted and dried as bar snacks. So it might be comparable to wings or something like that. And the Japanese buyers became enthralled with these, but they only wanted females, and they really wanted the most pregnant of females. These were the tastiest ones. The eggs were still inside, and so on. And so in some years, Newfoundland, I did a film on this many years ago with the BBC. In Newfoundland, for many years in a row, we dumped annually 40,000 tons.
Tons, not pounds.
Tons of male capelin that were useless to the marketplace, and deposited so many of them near our harbors because the fish plants wouldn't take them. There was no market for them. That some of our boats would actually run aground on the bodies of the male capelin. Now, you will never find a circumstance like, to find a circumstance like that with recreational hunting, it's not even fair to call it recreational hunting. You'd have to go back, and even if you did go back to the punt gunners and the people blasting the resting shorebirds, the egrets and the wading birds and so on,
they were still
even that you wouldn't find it at that scale. So, yes, they're all hunts, and they're conducted under a much less rigorous system of conservation regulation than the hunts that you and I are talking about.
Wow. That's why I wanted to bring that up, Shane. You did a great job of drawing those parallels and the contrasts.
Yeah. Well, it's incredible when you think about it. I mean, some of the fisheries are fairly specific, like lobster fisheries, you catch lobsters, but many of these open sea fisheries, they catch a lot of stuff that just killed. That's all.
Well, we've wrapped up a lot more discussion, and I want to make sure everybody listening or everybody watching knows where they can learn more of the Wild Harvest Initiative.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. As I said, they can look for me, just myself, and they will find their way to it. But the more direct way is to go to conservationvisions.com or to go to the wildharvestinitiative.com. There are two separate websites, but they are linked, and they do provide information on the activity on both sites. But we also have, of course, this is available on those sites, and they're both being revised at the present time, We have a lot of short films. We have a lot of popular articles that have been written about this. And so we also have a lot of other product books, small books and brochures and explanatory notes, fact sheets and so on and so forth that are accessible to the people who would come to find out more about this. And as we roll it on forward, in the next couple of years, there will be an explosion of information coming out about this because we are now at the point of really wanting to release the big data.
Yeah. And I know you have a very large Facebook page for Conservation Visions. I know
Yep.
you're working on a YouTube channel.
Yep.
And I'm going to prompt you to start an email newsletter when this information starts coming out.
Yeah.
So that I can give you my email and say, Shane, when you publish this stuff, let me know.
Yeah.
So,
That's a good idea. It's just one more thing to add to the list, you know.
but
The little boy with his cart, you know, there's only so much you can tow along behind there.
well, that's one of the most valuable things I think you
All
could
right,
have
well,
in
let's
your
talk
cart.
about that.
I can help you with that.
All right, man. That'll be great.
Thanks, Shane.
You're welcome. You're welcome.